Easter Sunday Massacre. For approximately 3 hours on Easter Sunday in 1975, a man sat alone on a couch in a house in Hamilton, Ohio. Around him, in the kitchen and the living room, lay the bodies of his mother, his brother, his sister-in-law, and all 8 of their children. A skillet of food was still warm on the stove. Easter candy was scattered across the floor. The youngest child was lying against the far end of that same couch, with his hands pressed to his ears. The man on the couch was James Ruppert. He had just taken 11 lives in under 5 minutes with 44 rounds from 4 separate firearms. A psychiatrist would later testify that during those 3 hours of silence, Ruppert considered ending his own life but decided against it, because he believed it would be a mortal sin. Instead, he changed his clothes, walked to the phone, and said 5 words: "There has been a shooting." It remains the largest feminicide committed by a single individual in American history. James Ruppert was born on March 29, 1934, in Hamilton. His mother, Charity, openly considered him a mistake. His father passed away from tuberculosis when James was 12, and his older brother, Leonard Jr., tormented him relentlessly throughout their youth. At 16, James attempted to end his own life. He survived and returned home. By 1975, James was 41, unemployed, unmarried, and still living in his mother's basement. His brother Leonard had become everything James was not: an engineering degree, a career at General Electric, a wife named Alma, someone James had once dated, and 8 children. James resented all of it. He had been diagnosed with paranoid psychosis. He believed the FBI had tapped his phone and that Leonard was orchestrating the surveillance. His finances had collapsed in the stock market crash of 1973. He owed his mother $3,500, and she had threatened to evict him. On Easter Sunday, Leonard's family came to Charity's house for dinner. The children hunted for eggs on the front lawn while James slept upstairs. He woke around 4 in the afternoon and came down to chat with his brother. During the conversation, Leonard asked how his Volkswagen was running. In any other family, this would have been small talk. But James believed Leonard had sabotaged the car. He interpreted the question as a deliberate taunt. He went back upstairs and loaded all 4 firearms. He came down carrying a revolver, 2 handguns, and a rifle. He propped the rifle against the refrigerator and raised the revolver. The church bells outside were ringing at 6 in the evening when he opened fire. Leonard fell first, then Alma. Struck once. Charity tried to stop him and was struck next. He moved through the kitchen and into the living room. 40 rounds hit their targets. The entire event lasted less than 5 minutes. The only sign of resistance in the house was a single, overturned wastebasket. When a man wipes out 600 years of combined human life in under 5 minutes, can any courtroom truly determine whether that act was the product of a rational mind? Ruppert stood trial 3 separate times. The first 2 ended in conviction on all 11 counts, but both were overturned on procedural errors. The third and final proceeding took place in 1982 before a jury of 8 women and 4 men. During the trial, a juror collapsed and passed away from a heart attack after viewing crime scene photographs. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury returned one of the most unusual verdicts in Ohio history: guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder for the deaths of his mother and brother. Not guilty by reason of insanity on the remaining 9. Prosecutors interpreted this as the jury concluding Ruppert acted with intent toward the 2 people he resented most, then lost all grip on reality in the moments that followed. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms and denied parole in 1995, 2005, and 2015. He never gave a single interview. He never expressed remorse. The tragedy extended further. Alma's father took his own life on Easter of 1978. Her mother, Edna, lived to 92. When she passed in 2004, her obituary noted she was preceded in death by 8 grandchildren. James Ruppert passed away on June 4, 2022, at the age of 88, at Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. He spent 47 years in prison without ever saying a word about what he did. The house at 635 Minor Avenue still stands. The Easter Sunday massacre case was driven by a lifetime of resentment and delusion. A man who believed his own family had conspired against him. But delusion is not the only thing that turns a family member into a threat. Sometimes the motive is far simpler, far colder, and calculated years in advance. The Ewell family. When Dale, Glee, and Tiffany Ewell were found in their Fresno, California home on April 21, 1992, investigators initially thought they were looking at a botched burglary. The scene had been staged to look that way. Drawers pulled open, items scattered. But the evidence told a different story, and the person behind it all was not some stranger who broke in through a window. It was someone who had eaten dinner at that table, grown up in that house, and stood to inherit millions if the people inside it were gone. Dale Allen Ewell was a self-made multimillionaire who built his fortune through Western Piper Sales, a company specializing in small aviation aircraft. He also invested heavily in local farmland and the stock market. The family's estimated wealth sat between $7 and $8 million. His wife Glee was a former Spanish translator for the CIA in the 1950s, a philanthropist, and a dedicated teacher. Their daughter Tiffany, 24, was a graduate student at Fresno State. Despite their wealth, the Ewells lived modestly in a 3,600-square-foot home at East Park Circle Drive in Fresno's Sunnyside neighborhood. They also owned a beach house at Pajaro Dunes, a cabin at Shaver Lake, and 2 160-acre farms. Their son Dana was 21 years old and had just earned a finance degree from Santa Clara University. He was obsessed with status, money, and appearances. He idolized Donald Trump and regularly presented himself to classmates as a self-made millionaire, despite having no real business of his own. Behind the image was a young man consumed by one thing: the fortune sitting in his parents' estate. The family spent Easter weekend at their Pajaro Dunes beach house. On Easter Sunday, April 19th, Dana separated from his family to have dinner with his girlfriend, Monica Zent, and her father, who happened to be an FBI agent. It was an airtight alibi, and it was constructed deliberately. While Dana sat at dinner miles away, his college friend Joel Patrick Radovchich was hiding inside the Ewell home on East Park Circle Drive, lying in wait on a plastic sheet. He had shaved his entire body to avoid leaving behind any trace evidence and wore multiple layers of latex gloves. He was armed with a 9mm specialty rifle, fitted with a homemade silencer constructed from tennis balls. Glee and Tiffany arrived home first. Tiffany was struck down with a single shot. Glee was struck 4 times. Prosecutors later stated that she was the only victim who saw her attacker's face, and that in that moment, she almost certainly understood that her own son was behind what was happening to her. Dale arrived roughly 30 minutes later and was struck from behind as he stepped in through the garage. Radovchich then staged the scene to resemble a break-in and left. The bodies were not discovered until 2 days later, on April 21st, when Dale failed to show up for work. Detective John Souza was among the first to recognize that the supposed burglary did not add up. The staging was too clean, too deliberate. Donna became the primary suspect almost immediately. Family members told investigators he had been fixated on the details of his parents' will and was visibly frustrated that most of the wealth was locked in trusts he could not access until his 30s. Within weeks of the deaths, Donna and Radovchich moved into the family home together. Radovchich, who was unemployed at the time, began taking helicopter lessons at $500 an hour, funded entirely by Dana. Was this the behavior of a grieving son, or of someone who believed he had gotten away with it? The case broke when investigators traced the firearm used in the attack through company records to a man named Ernest Ponce, a friend of Radovicic. Ponce eventually confessed to helping dispose of the gun barrel in a vacant lot in Reseda, California. Forensic testing confirmed that the weapon matched the rounds recovered from the scene. Tennis ball fibers from the homemade silencer also matched fibers found on the victims. On March 2, 1995, nearly 3 years after the murders, Dinah Ewell and Joel Radovicic were arrested. The trial began on December 16, 1997, and lasted over 8 months. On May 12, 1998, the jury found both men guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. During the penalty phase, the jury deadlocked, voting 11-1 in favor of the death penalty for Dana and 10-2 for Joel. Both were sentenced instead to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As of 2025, Dinah Ewell, now 55 years old, remains incarcerated at California State Prison in Corcoran. Joel Radovicic is held at Mule Creek State Prison. Dinah applied for executive clemency in January 2022. There is no indication it was granted. Neither man will ever be released. Dinah Ewell orchestrated the end of his own family for money he never got to spend. But the case that comes next involves a scale of loss so staggering it held the record in New York City for decades. The Palm Sunday Massacre. On April 15, 1984, a Palm Sunday afternoon drenched in rain, 2 women and 8 children were sitting in a small apartment at 1080 Liberty Avenue in the East New York section of Brooklyn. They were watching television, relaxing on the couches. One of the women, Carmen Perez, was feeding chocolate pudding to her 13-month-old daughter, Christina. It was an ordinary moment in an ordinary home. And then a man they knew walked through the door, carrying 2 handguns. Christopher Thomas Jr. opened fire and did not stop until he had taken the lives of everyone in that room except for a baby girl who was too small for him to notice. The relaxed, seated poses of the victims were left undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle. They never had a chance to stand up. To understand how this happened, you have to understand who Christopher Thomas was and what brought him to that door. Thomas, 34, was a severe cocaine addict from the Bronx who had been freebasing for approximately 2 years. He was known by the nickname Chris Cross because anyone who crossed him became a target of his violence. He had a prior conviction for attempted violence and had served 3 years in the early 1970s. Just 1 week before the massacre, he had been released on a $500 bond for allegedly beating his estranged wife. He owed Enrique Bermudez, the leaseholder of the Liberty Avenue apartment and a convicted cocaine dealer, somewhere between $7,000 and $9,000. He also believed, without evidence, that Bermudez was having an affair with his estranged wife. Thomas had visited the apartment that morning looking for drugs and cash. He returned around 5:30 in the evening. Bermudez was not home. Inside were his girlfriend, Virginia Perez, who was 8 months pregnant, her cousin Carmen Perez, and 8 children from the extended family. Thomas entered the apartment armed with a .22 caliber pistol and a .38 caliber revolver. He fired 19 rounds at close range, most of them aimed at the heads of his victims. Virginia Perez was 24. Carmen Perez was 20. The children ranged from toddlers to young teenagers. Virginia's unborn child also perished, bringing the total to 11 lives ended in a matter of minutes. The sole survivor was Christina Rivera, Carmen's 13-month-old daughter, found crawling among the fallen, crying and covered in blood. She was carried from the home by Officer Joanne Jaffe in a moment captured by photographers that would make front pages across the country. At the time, it was the largest mass killing in New York City's history. Tips led investigators to Thomas within 9 days. Bermudez himself identified Thomas as a regular drug customer. a teenage witness placed Thomas at the scene. When police came to make the arrest, Thomas was already sitting in a Bronx jail on unrelated charges. He was formally charged on June 19, 1984, with 10 counts of murder. How does someone take 10 lives in a single afternoon and face anything less than the full weight of the law? The trial began on July 5, 1985, before Justice Ronald Aiello. Defense attorney Martin Schmuckler argued that Thomas suffered from diminished capacity brought on by extreme emotional disturbance from his cocaine addiction. After 16 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict that stunned the city. Guilty on 10 counts of first-degree manslaughter, not murder. The jury foreman later explained to reporters that the drugs had been the deciding factor. Thomas was sentenced to 8 1/3 to 25 years on each count to be served consecutively. On paper, that amounted to 83 1/3 to 250 years. But under New York state law at the time, the effective maximum was capped at 50 years. Thomas was denied parole 5 times between 2009 and 2017. On January 5, 2018, at the age of 68, he was granted mandatory conditional release. Under the law that existed when he was sentenced, prisoners who served 2/3 of their maximum sentence with good behavior were automatically released. Thomas reportedly lives in Queens and reports to a Manhattan parole office. His parole runs through June 6, 2034. No public reports of violations have surfaced. New York has since changed that law. Under the current statute, inmates receive only 1/7 off their maximum sentence instead of 1/3. But Thomas was grandfathered under the old rules. Christina Rivera, the baby who survived, was later adopted by the very officer who carried her from that apartment. Joanne Jaffe went on to become the highest-ranking uniformed female officer in the history of the NYPD. If the Palm Sunday massacre shows what happens when the justice system arrives too late to protect the most vulnerable, then the next case shows what happens when the system deliberately looks the other way for more than half a century. Irene Garza. In 1960, a 25-year-old schoolteacher named Irene Garza walked into Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen, Texas, on the evening of Holy Saturday to make her confession. She told her parents she would be back shortly. 57 years would pass before anyone was held accountable for what happened to her that night. And the reason it took that long was not because no one knew who was responsible. It was because the people with the power to act chose to protect the institution instead. Irene Garza was a trailblazer in the Rio Grande Valley. She was born on November 15, 1934, to Nicholas and Josefina Garza, who owned a dry cleaning business in McAllen. She became the first Latina twirler and head drum majorette at McAllen High School. She was crowned homecoming queen and prom queen at Pan American College and held the title of Miss All South Texas Sweetheart in 1958. She earned a degree in education and became a beloved second-grade teacher at Thigpen Elementary, where she spent her first paycheck buying books and clothes for her students. She was a devout Catholic and a member of the Legion of Mary. On the evening of April 16, 1960, several parishioners saw Irene at Sacred Heart Church. A 27-year-old visiting priest named John Feit heard her confession. But instead of using the standard confessional, Feit heard her confession in the rectory, which was considered highly unusual. Church members noticed that Feit's line moved slowly that evening and that he was absent multiple times. Irene never returned home. Her father filed a missing persons report at 3:10 in the morning on Easter Sunday. 2 days later, passers-by found a trail along a McAllen road. Her patent leather purse, a single shoe, her lace veil. The largest volunteer search in Rio Grande Valley history was mobilized. On April 21st, 5 days after she disappeared, Irene's body was recovered, face down in an irrigation canal. The autopsy determined she had been suffocated, assaulted while unconscious, and bludgeoned She was found fully clothed, except for her shoes and undergarments. When the canal was drained, investigators found Feet's personal photo viewer and a candelabra from Sacred Heart Church near where the body had been placed. Feet himself sent a note to police identifying the viewer as his. Fellow priests noticed visible scratch marks on his hands after Easter Vigil. A polygraph examination on June 9, 1960, according to investigators, definitively implicated him. When asked to suggest a question for the polygraph, Feet proposed whether it was possible he may have said or done something that caused Irene's passing. He answered yes to his own question, but the evidence went further. 3 weeks before Irene's disappearance, Feet had attacked a 20-year-old woman named Maria America Guerra as she knelt at the communion rail at a church in nearby Edinburgh. The first trial in that case ended in a hung jury. Feet ultimately pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of misdemeanor assault and was fined just $500. And then, according to later accounts, a deal was reached. The Catholic Church hierarchy and the Hidalgo County District Attorney's Office reportedly came to an understanding that would spare Feet from prosecution for what happened to Irene Garza. He was quietly sent to a Trappist monastery. Later, he became a leader at the Servants of the Paraclete, a retreat center for troubled priests in Jemez Springs, New Mexico. He left the priesthood in 1972, married, and settled in Scottsdale, Arizona. Irene's parents, Nicholas and Josefina, both passed away in the 1990s without ever seeing anyone answer for their daughter's death. In 2002, McAllen police reopened the investigation. A former monk named Dale Tashini came forward and revealed that in 1963, Feet had confessed to him. Feet described taking the life of a young woman on Easter weekend and explained in detail how he had used a cellophane bag to suffocate her. Despite this, the longtime district attorney, Rene Guerra, refused to seriously pursue the case. He presented the evidence to a grand jury in 2004, but never subpoenaed the key witnesses. How many years does a community have to wait before the truth is allowed to matter more than the institution that buried it? The case gained national attention when CBS's 48 Hours aired the story in 2014. A new district attorney, Ricardo Rodriguez, was elected on a promise to reopen the investigation. In February 2016, the 83-year-old John Feet was indicted and arrested in Scottsdale. His trial took place in Edinburgh, Texas, in late November 2017. Dale Tashani, then 88 years old, took the stand and testified about the confession Feet had made to him more than 5 decades earlier. On December 7, 2017, the jury found John Feet guilty of murder with malice. He was sentenced to life in prison the following day. John Bernard Feet passed away on February 11, 2020, at the age of 87, from cardiac arrest in his cell at the Estelle unit near Huntsville, South Texas. He had served just over 2 years of his sentence. His appeal was discontinued. A relative of Irene's, Noemi Sigler, offered a final reflection, saying simply that he now stands before the ultimate judge. As of 2025, the case stands as one of the longest delays between a crime and a conviction in American history. It took 57 years, 2 district attorneys, and a monk's conscience to bring Irene Garza a measure of justice. In Irene Garza's case, the church shielded a priest from prosecution for decades. But that pattern of institutional silence did not end in South Texas. 20 years later, in another city, in another chapel, it would happen again. If you're liking this video, consider subscribing. We post daily crime videos, so make sure you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to the next case. Sister Margaret Ann Paul. On the morning of Holy Saturday in 1980, a fellow nun walked into the sacristy of Mercy Hospital's chapel in Toledo, Ohio, and found the body of a 71-year-old sister lying on her back. Her habit had been pulled up. An altar cloth partially covered her. 9 of the wounds on her chest had been arranged in the shape of an inverted cross, and her forehead had been smeared with her own blood in what appeared to be a grotesque imitation of last rites. Investigators knew almost immediately who had done this, but it would take 24 years before anyone was charged, because the people who could have pushed for justice chose silence instead. Sister Margaret Ann Paul was born on April 6, 1908 in Edgerton, Ohio. She was a registered nurse, a science teacher, and a hospital administrator who entered the Sisters of Mercy Order in 1926. By 1971, she had taken on a role overseeing the chapel and sacristy at Mercy Hospital. She was described by those who knew her as kind and gentle, but exacting in her standards. On the day she was found, she was one day short of her 72nd birthday. Her alarm had sounded at 5 that morning. She was seen at breakfast around 6:15. Sometime around 7, a witness reported the sound of arguing near the chapel. By 8, she was gone. She had been strangled first, then stabbed approximately 31 times. The wounds to her chest formed a deliberate pattern. Prosecutors would later describe elements of the scene as consistent with a ritualistic act. A book describing how to perform a black mass was eventually found among the suspect's belongings. Father Gerald Robinson, 42 years old at the time, was the hospital chaplain. He worked closely with Sister Margaret Ann, but their relationship was strained. The day before the attack, on Good Friday, Robinson had cut a service short, visibly upsetting her. From the very beginning, detectives focused on him. A sword-shaped letter opener found in his quarters appeared consistent with the stab wounds. Robinson lied to investigators, claiming someone else had confessed the act to him. He later admitted that was fabricated. He failed a polygraph. Then, on April 18, 1980, something happened that would effectively shut the case down for over 2 decades. During Robinson's interrogation, at a point when detectives believed they were close to a confession, 3 men arrived at the door. Deputy Police Chief Ray Vetter, a practicing Catholic, Diocesan Attorney Henry Herschel, and Monsignor Jerome Schmidt. The detective was told to leave the room. When the door reopened, Robinson walked out a free man. Some investigation reports that Vetter had requested subsequently vanished. Robinson went on to preside over Sister Margaret Ann's funeral 4 days later. How does a suspect walk out of an interrogation room and into a pulpit to eulogize the very person investigators believe he harmed? Toledo in 1980 was a deeply Catholic city. The bishop carried enormous influence. DNA technology did not exist. The letter opener sat in storage without detailed forensic examination. The Paul family did not even learn that Robinson had been a suspect until his arrest, which would not come for another 24 years. The catalyst for reopening the case was the broader Catholic Church abuse crisis. In 2003, a woman appeared before the Toledo Diocese Review Board and described being subjected to ritualistic abuse by multiple priests, including Robinson. Her testimony reached the Lucas County Cold Case Unit. Detectives Tom Ross and Steve Forrester recognized Robinson's name and pulled the old files. New forensic analysis revealed that bloodstain patterns on the altar cloth were consistent with the sword-shaped letter opener having been laid across it while still wet. A small medallion on the handle appeared to match a faint impression on the fabric. Sister Margaret Ann's remains were exhumed on May 20, 2004, and a forensic pathologist found that the tip of the letter opener fit a puncture wound in her jawbone with extraordinary precision, described as fitting like a key in a lock. On April 23, 2004, Gerald Robinson was arrested at the age of 66 and charged with aggravated murder. His trial began on April 24, 2006, and was broadcast on the 23rd of April, 2006, and was broadcast gavel to gavel by Court TV. It was believed to be the first trial in the United States of a Catholic priest charged with taking the life of a nun. On May 11, 2006, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Robinson guilty. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Every appeal he filed was rejected through the Ohio Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court alike. Gerald Robinson passed away on July 4, 2014, at the age of 76, following a severe heart attack at Franklin Medical Center, a prison facility in Columbus, Ohio. A request for early release had been denied shortly before. Over 250 people attended his funeral mass, including nearly 50 priests, a decision that drew sharp criticism from victims' advocacy groups. The Catholic Church never formally stripped him of his priestly title. As of 2025, Sister Margaret Ann Paul's case remains one of the most disturbing intersections of faith and violence in American criminal history. An institution meant to protect its most devoted chose instead to protect itself. But if the decades-long cover-up in Toledo reveals what happens when institutions turn away, the next case reveals something arguably more terrifying. What happens when the threat is already inside the building, hiding in plain sight? Stephanie Scott. In April of 2015, a 26-year-old teacher named Stephanie Scott drove to Leeton High School in rural New South Wales, Australia, on Easter Sunday morning. She was there to prepare lesson plans for the substitute who would cover her classes later that week. She had a good reason to be away. Her wedding was in 6 days. Roughly 100 guests were expected. The honeymoon to Tahiti was booked. Stephanie never left the school. The man who was waiting inside had searched the internet the day before for terms related to harming brides. He had a pre-prepared kit that included a large knife. And despite this history, he had passed every background check required to work in a building full of children. Stephanie Claire Scott was born on October 14, 1988, in Canowindra, New South Wales. She was the daughter of Robert and Marilyn Scott, and was universally described by students and colleagues as happy, warm, and deeply committed to her work as an English and drama teacher. She was engaged to Aaron Leeson Woolley, her partner of 5 years, and her favorite color was yellow, a detail that would later take on a meaning no one could have anticipated. Vincent Stanford, 24 years old, worked as a casual cleaner at the same school. He had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but the clinical label concealed something far darker. He later told a psychologist that he had experienced thoughts of taking a life since he was 7 or 8 years old. As a student, he had once tried to strangle a teacher. Police would later discover over 1,800 images on his devices and a notebook meticulously documenting the movements of multiple women in Leeton, including a young girl. The day before the attack, he had searched online for serial killer knives, along with terms explicitly related to harming brides. On Easter Sunday morning, Stanford was at the school despite being on leave, when Stephanie arrived around 11 and began working in the staff room. Stanford went home, retrieved his pre-assembled kit, which included a knife with a blade measuring 35 to 40 centimeters, and returned. As Stephanie was getting ready to leave, she told him to have a happy Easter. Stanford grabbed her from behind, dragged her into a storeroom, threw her to the ground, struck her repeatedly, and stabbed her. He later told police, in a tone investigators described as flat, that he had to do it, but was not angry or anything. What followed was methodical. Stanford went home, ate a sandwich and drank coffee, then returned to the school to clean the storeroom. He loaded the body into Stephanie's red Mazda, drove approximately 70 kilometers to Cocopara National Park, and set her remains on fire. He photographed what he had done. He threw her work laptop into a canal. He dumped the car in a field. Then he stole her engagement ring, her graduation ring, and her license, and mailed them to his twin brother Marcus in Adelaide. Would a community of 11,000 people, where everyone knows everyone, be able to find out what happened to a woman who vanished from the place where she was supposed to be safest? Aaron reported Stephanie missing on Easter Monday. A massive community search was organized. Police quickly noticed that Stanford's vehicle had been at the school all weekend. When questioned, Stanford claimed he had been at a shop that was closed on Easter Sunday. The alibi collapsed immediately. A search of his bedroom turned up Stephanie's school keys, an item of her clothing, and 2 photographs of a burnt body on his camera. He was arrested on April 8th. Stephanie's remains were found on April 10th at the edges of Cocopara National Park. Her laptop was recovered by divers from the canal. On July 20th, 2016, Vincent Stanford pleaded guilty to murder and aggravated assault. His sentencing took place on October 13th, 2016, one day before what would have been Stephanie's 28th birthday. Justice Robert Allen Hume handed down a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, stating that the level of wrongdoing was so extreme that the community's interest in justice could only be met with one response. On what should have been her wedding day, Erin wore yellow and gathered with hundreds of mourners in Mountford Park. They released yellow balloons into the sky. Across Australia, women hung wedding dresses on their front doors in a movement that became known by the hashtag #PutYourDressOut. Over 1,500 people attended her funeral. An outdoor amphitheater was later built at the school in her memory. Stanford's twin brother Marcus received the stolen rings and sold them for $705. He burnt the license. He pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact and served approximately 15 months. In 2024 and 2025, New South Wales Police issued a public appeal to locate Marcus for unrelated offenses. In a further tragedy, Stephanie's father, Robert Scott, was struck and killed by a falling tree at the family property in late October 2016, just weeks after Stanford's sentencing. As of 2025, Vincent Stanford remains in prison with no eligibility for parole and no indication that his abandoned appeal will be revived. The community of Leeton has never fully recovered. Stephanie Scott went to work on a quiet Easter morning to make sure her students would be taken care of while she was away getting married. That impulse, that generosity, is what brought her into the path of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. But if this case shows how violence can hide behind the most ordinary of settings, the final case takes place in one of the most remote communities on Earth, where a killing went unsolved for years because nobody thought to compare the evidence they already had. Janelle Patton. Norfolk Island sits roughly 1,400 kilometers east of mainland Australia in the South Pacific, a tiny territory with a population of around 1,500 people. It was settled in 1856 by descendants of the HMS Bounty mutineers from Pitcairn Island. In 2002, the island had its own legal system, limited self-government, and just 2 local police officers. Remarkably, the island still had a law on its books that permitted death by hanging for capital offenses. The last time someone had been taken in connection with a serious crime on Norfolk Island was over a century earlier, in 1893. On Easter Sunday morning in 2002, a 29-year-old woman named Janelle Patton went for her daily walk along a coastal track. Her parents, Ron and Carol, had arrived from mainland Australia just the day before for an Easter visit. Friends described Janelle as being really excited, practically skipping around at the thought of spending the holiday with them. She was due to pick them up at 1 in the afternoon for lunch. She never arrived. Janelle Louise Patton was born in Sydney and had moved to Norfolk Island around 1999 or 2000, looking for a fresh start after a series of difficult relationships in Sydney. One abusive former partner had broken her jaw. She found work in hospitality at one of the island's hotels and was described by friends as bubbly and outgoing. Her father would later say that Norfolk Island was Janelle's paradise. That evening, when Janelle failed to appear, her parents reported her missing. Police told them a body had already been found approximately 90 minutes earlier by 2 New Zealand tourists at Cockpit Waterfall Reserve on the opposite end of the island. Janelle's body was discovered wrapped in a large black plastic sheet. She had suffered 64 separate injuries, stab wounds numbering over 65, a fractured skull caused by a saw, blade driven through her eye with extreme force, a broken pelvis, a broken ankle, extensive bruising, multiple defensive wounds to her hands where she had grabbed the blade of her attacker's knife, nearly severing her own thumb. A coronial inquest estimated that she fought for approximately 15 minutes. The cause of death was ultimately a stab wound to the chest that punctured her lung. No motive was ever established. The two local officers immediately called in the Australian Federal Police, but there was a complication. AFP detectives had to be formally sworn in as Norfolk Island constables before they were legally permitted to interview anyone. The island's close-knit community was deeply suspicious of mainland authority. Only 56% of residents completed the police survey, compared to 84% of visitors. Heavy rain on the day of the attack had washed away much of the physical evidence from the outdoor scene. Investigators compiled a list of every person on the island that day, all 2,771 of them. A mass fingerprint drive was conducted. 10 fingerprints were found on the black plastic sheet. A coronial inquest in 2004 named 16 persons of interest, but produced no definitive suspect. For a community this small, where almost everyone knows everyone, how does something this violent remain unanswered for years? The breakthrough came when Detective Sergeant Bob Peters, reviewing old case files, found a fingerprint card from a burglary investigation that had been conducted shortly after the attack. A man named Glenn McNeil had been questioned and fingerprinted in connection with that burglary. But his prints had never been compared to the evidence from the crime that mattered most. When the comparison was finally made, 2 of the fingerprints on the black plastic sheet matched McNeil. Further, in McNeil's abandoned white Honda Civic, investigators found glass particles that match those recovered from Janelle's body, along with human hairs that matched her DNA profile. Glenn Peter Charles McNeil was a New Zealand citizen from Nelson who worked as a chef. He had moved to Norfolk Island around 2000 with his girlfriend and married her in January 2002, just 2 months before the attack. No relationship between McNeil and Janelle Patton was ever established. After the events of Easter Sunday, McNeil left the island and returned to New Zealand. He was arrested on February 1st, 2006, near Nelson. He initially confessed, claiming he had accidentally struck Patton with his car while under the influence of marijuana, panicked, and then stabbed her to ensure she would not survive. Norfolk Island had revoked its death by hanging statute in late January 2006, just before his extradition. His trial began on February 1st, 2007, in the Supreme Court of Norfolk Island. McNeil retracted his confession and delivered an unsworn statement, a legal option under Norfolk Island's system that shielded him from cross-examination. He told the court he did not do it. The prosecution presented his earlier confession, the matching fingerprints, the glass particles, and the DNA evidence from his vehicle. On March 9th, 2007, all 11 jurors found Glenn McNeil guilty. He was sentenced on July 25, 2007, to 24 years in prison with an 18-year non-parole period. The Chief Justice stated that the crime had shocked the small community and sickened the people of Australia. All appeals were dismissed through the Federal Court and the High Court of Australia. Glenn McNeil was released on January 31, 2024, after serving his full non-parole period. As a New Zealand citizen convicted of a serious offense in Australia, he was immediately deported, arriving in Christchurch. He's now living in New Zealand under conditions imposed by a returning offenders order. The case contributed to broader questions about Norfolk Island's capacity to govern itself. In 2015, Australia abolished the island's self-government entirely. Civilian law enforcement is now provided directly by the Australian Federal Police. As of 2025, Janelle Patton's family continues to live with the knowledge that the man responsible for her death is free. She had moved to a remote island in the South Pacific, looking for safety and peace. She found it for a little while, and then, on an Easter Sunday morning walk, it was taken from her. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you liked the video, and click here to view our next video.